Okay, cool.
As long as you keep it.
All right, just wait if you can't hear me at any point. Okay, I'm going to begin by ripping a bit off what Jackie was saying. Somehow or other, I moved to Melbourne, I think, 4 years ago now, and most of my Melbourne friends are either Muslim, for obvious reasons, or Jewish. And in the case of the Jewish network, we're drawn together by common experiences of migration and settlement and racism, you know, whether here or whether prior to migration. And a couple of years ago now, it would be a group of us, and we were conscious of making it a Muslim-Jewish excursion, went to see a French film whose name I can't remember, but Google will probably be your friend. And this French film was set in the Paris Mosque, which was built in the 1920s as a thank you to the Algerian troops who had served with France in World War I. And during World War II, the mufti of this mosque gave identity papers to French Jews of Algerian background who look essentially the same as Muslims, Algerian Muslims, saying they were Muslims rather than French, because of course the Jews were being sent to Auschwitz and the Muslims were not. And so he provided them with fake papers. According to the movies, he set up a headstone in the cemetery to the father of one Algerian Jewish guy in order to reinforce his story, to provide evidence for his story that he was Muslim and from a Muslim family. And yeah, next time you're in Paris, I really suggest a visit to that mosque. By the way, it's quite central, near an attractive park. And have you been, Jackie? Yeah, you can so Jackie can tell you also, you can get yourself a really lovely Moroccan tea, go to the bathhouse as well, take a towel. They're well used to non-Muslim, Jackie, you can support me on that, they're well used to non-Muslim visitors there. And it's a really lovely, not just to go to pray, it's a really lovely, peaceful spot to just go and like I said, lovely pastries. But anyhow, so now swinging back to the actual title of my topic. Having so many Jewish friends here in Melbourne, I was taken aback and saddened to see a visible, very, very small, but visible Jewish presence at a Wilders lecture last year, I think it was, wasn't it? Which I assume, although I didn't speak to them, would have been for obvious reasons arising from the Israel-Palestine conflict. People are generally taken aback when you talk about Jews and Muslims getting along on an individual level. They assume that there's no way that can happen anymore. But in fact, there's enough in common, and Jews and Muslims have lived together in various locations for long enough that they're, anyway. I chose Geert Wilders and his visit to Australia as a point of entry because he epitomizes this wave of anti-Muslim racism that has arisen within Europe. And now, explaining the term anti-Muslim racism, I'm once again going to swing back to the topic of Jews, even though I was supposed to be talking about Muslims. Because I know when I use that term, anti-Muslim racism, people can get very uptight and say Muslims are a religion and not a race. So how can you talk about anti-Muslim racism? And for that, I would cite various Jewish scholars, including one, Jeff Levy, who's at UNSW, you can look him up, who talk about how anti-Semitism also began as a religious prejudice. It was initially about, religious difference, and it then morphed into a racial difference once ideas about eugenics and racism arose sort of towards the end of the 19th century, and of course in most deadly form during the 20th century. And you can see a similar process happening with Muslims, not with Islam as a faith and with Muslims as the way they practice that faith, but with the way that Muslims are identified and treated as this homogenous and threatening group. And even those of Muslim descent who no longer identify religiously as Muslim stigmatized in the same way as those who practice their faith very strongly. Well, you only have to look at Barack Obama for that. Here's a guy who goes to church every week, who's, who identifies very publicly as Christian, but having a Muslim father who he barely met, or ever, did he ever meet his father? And having lived in Indonesia, that is enough for a scary proportion of Americans to believe that he's a secret Muslim, And so those Muslims or people of Muslim background who have left their faith, still come under suspicion as practicing that faith in private. And you can see that this, again, if you look at history, Jews in Spain in particular, once they left their faith, the conversos, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, who converted to Christianity were under constant suspicion and always, thought of as being not really Christian, always thought of as being, secret Jews, secretly, I remember reading about someone of, centuries ago, finding that they were in fact of Jewish background in Spain, and the trigger for going into that history was thinking, why does my family always keep a ham in the window that nobody ever eats? That they never touch. But the reason they had started keeping a ham in the window was, to show that they had ham, even though they didn't eat it, to distance themselves from the suspicion that they hadn't really converted. And again, sorry. But anyhow, back to Wilders. So, I have to say, I covered his lecture in Melbourne for Crikey, which is an online magazine, and it was really one of the most scary experiences of my life. And I speak as someone who went to Pakistan immediately after 9/11. But yeah, scary because it was in Australia, scary because it was in a Melbourne suburb where I didn't particularly expect to feel under threat. But yeah, among other, there was fairly amateurish security, and including a guy who looked like a gentle old grandfather, who I wasn't as badly disabled looking as I am now on that occasion, but I was still using a stick, who helped me down the stairs, but who then told me, who asked me why I was there, and I said that I was Muslim, said that I was welcome to stay, but that if I disrupted proceedings in any way, I would be evicted in a way that would compound my disability. Within your position shouldn't be. And I found it hard to believe that this gentle grandfatherly looking old man had just, threatened me, and all the rest of it. But yeah, and Wilders himself is a very charismatic speaker, and and I guess some of the women looked frankly turned on, not to take you to a bad visual place, but rapturous, holding their arms out, it was alarming on that level. Oh, I've got to say, there was one Jew who I did know, and who was there with a Lebanese Muslim friend undercover because they too were scared and alarmed, and we had a conversation afterwards about how terrified we all felt. But anyhow, so she was there, they were there for similar reasons to me. But anyhow, getting back to Wilders himself. So he announced himself as a visitor with a message from the old Holland to the new Holland, harking back to Australia, having been once referred to as New Holland. And he was there with a warning. And this you see very often in discussions of the Muslim threat, that what has happened in Europe, what is being undertaken in Europe is what Muslims intend to undertake worldwide. America will be next, Australia will be next. It's all part of the jihad, against the whole world. And so he says, the Islamic presence is changing the outlook and the character of Europe. In some urban neighborhoods, Islamic regulations are already being enforced. Women's rights are being trampled. We are confronted with headscarves and burqas, polygamy, female genital mutilation, honor killings. And so, he then talks about Muslim neighborhoods being no-go areas, the Islamization of Europe, which he and other writers have started referring to Europe as Eurabia, saying that there's so many Muslims there that it's basically not Europe anymore, it's European. Anyhow, so it is true that the decades since World War II have seen an influx of Muslim migrants to European states, in many cases from their former colonies. The Indian subcontinent, in the case of the United Kingdom, the Maghreb, in the case of France, less so in the Netherlands. They're mostly from non-former colonies like Turkey and Morocco, also Suriname, which is a former Dutch colony. So the numbers of Muslims that are now settled in Europe, that's unknown in many cases because the census in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands does not include a question about religion, as it does in Australia, by the way, but it's an optional question, so it's pretty soft. It's still guesswork even here. So in most of Europe, the numbers of how many Muslims there, even the most credible ones, are based on people's countries of origins, and assuming that country of origin is synonymous with religion. But there are some very alarmist guesstimates out there which say that, which generate media stories about how this European city or that will be Muslim majority like tomorrow. But I included in the reading list, I did it, but I was a bit late submitting it. Again, Google would be your friend on that. There's a BBC article about that, which is very short, which talks about the maths on that and basically discredits it. It's, as I said, it's wildly inflated, and it also, for one thing, it's assuming that the sorry, I'm aware of not wanting to sound Andrew Bolt on this, but it's kind of assuming that every Muslim baby born to Muslim parents, and there's a whole complicated issue of what religious identity consists of, to the extent that that a child of Muslim parents is likely always to identify with Islam, to the extent of celebrating Muslim holidays with their families, to the extent, I've got to say, sorry, I keep bringing juice into this, of probably not eating ham, that tends to be the last thing. They might be drinking alcohol like crazy, but ham, no, So to that extent, the offspring of Muslim parents is likely to identify with Islam to that extent, but to talk about it as though they're going to continue to be part of the Islamization of Europe, to identify, and that Islam is going to be their primary form of identity, more than national identity, more than their favourite rock band, I think is a stretch. And if you don't ask me, just ask my daughter. She can talk about that at great length. She's Muslim if she's talking to Andrew Bolt or Corey Bernardi or someone like that. She's not if she's been hauled along by her mother to some, to some mosque events where there's too many of what she refers to as beardy weirdies. Yeah. So anyhow, so if we talk about it was initially assumed when Muslim migrants, and not just Muslims, by the way, in the UK, for example, plenty of Hindus and Sikhs with that influx as well. It was initially assumed that these migrants were guest workers who would eventually return to their country of origin, having made some extra money, and so there were insufficient resources provided for that process of settlement, and there was limited entitlement, varying from country to country, for migration by wives and other family members. So it was a rocky settling in period. And they also faced significant levels of racism and racial violence. But at that stage, it was colour racism. It was racism based on the colour of their skin, by the fact that they physically didn't look like everybody else. Of course, their religion came into it, but it wasn't primarily religious racism. And so this transformation of the nature of racism is one of the processes we've seen in the decades since. And so this has been variously named, in some cases from colour racism to culture racism. It's also been referred to as just old racism to new racism. I just say that the targets of old and new racism are often broadly the same. Broadly, people of Pakistani background in the UK, again, people of Maghrebi background in France. And it doesn't actually, and old and new racism tends to feel much the same if you're on the receiving end of it. Whether you're being called khaki or being called a Muzi or whatever the hell. And basically, you're still getting the message to go back to where you came from. You're still being told that you don't fit in. And you're still, potentially being bashed for it. So, sorry. Now, I would say also, in terms of what Muslim migrants' expectations were when they arrived in Europe, just as I said that governments and populations within Europe thought of it as being like a temporary process, many migrants also thought the same way, also thought that they were going to just earn some money and then go back home. And still, I have to say, well, my own family who migrated to the UK in the 50s still talk about going back to and building a big house in Pakistan, still talk about going back home, which I think migrants, Jackie, you'd be able to, or maybe tell me that I'm wrong, but that often remains a migrant dream, do you not think, among people from many places to sort of, to return?
Maybe that first generation.
Yeah. Oh yes, first generation, yeah. To go back home, but to go back home at a higher level than you left it at, to go back home having jumped up a class or two, to go back home and, and all the neighbours are going to be jealous. Now I've got to say Dubai is the destination for that, not going back home. Dubai is the destination to go and hopefully make some money and then go back. And, this is a bit of a side thing. But in Pakistan, for example, the headscarf means different things in different locations. In Pakistan, the headscarf is a status symbol of a family that has lived in Dubai, because it's not the form of covering that's mostly used in Pakistan. It's usually a scarf. Rather than that sort of particular new Islamic headscarf, it's usually a scarf. The new Islamic headscarf, it's one of the goods that you bring back from Dubai along with the DVD player or whatever the shoes. You bring back the wife who's wearing the Dubai-style headscarf. You're sort of telling everybody that that's where you've been and that you've come up in the world and that you're a bit better than everybody else. And your religion is that you're more modern than everybody else. And so, hence, you'll be going to the exhibition afterwards, which will go into the whole issue of dress in more detail. And don't forget to read my fabulous essay in the catalogue book. I won't talk too much about dress in Europe, but anyhow. So Muslims, as Wilders and others have claimed, they're said to be a threat to Europe's Enlightenment heritage, to values such as secularism, free speech, and gender equality. And so the backlash in defense of these values has been savage, ranging from politicians such as Wilders to the 2000 terrorist attack in Norway, in which 77 lives were lost. Most of those lives, of course, being non-Muslim. That's interesting as well, that the anti-Muslim backlash has been directed also at left-wing multiculturalism in general, who are seen as having facilitated this Islamization, as being fellow travelers, as not having stood up against this invasion. And so, if we return again to the Netherlands, on the issue of free speech, and again, this refers to this. One key moment in that, besides the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, but then there was the murder of Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh. And Wilders, as Wilders says, Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh was slaughtered in broad daylight because he had criticized Islam. A few hours later, police found a letter written by Van Gogh's assassin threatening to kill me and my colleague Hirsi Ali as well. And so getting back to that, I would recommend a book by Ian Barama called Murder in Amsterdam, which talks about that particular incident and Muslims in Europe more generally. It's really good. But anyhow. Okay, so Van Gogh's assassin was a young second generation guy from a Muslim family who had, like many teenagers who fall into various types of crime, a disrupted family background, whose mother had died, who had been estranged from education, who didn't see a future for himself in the Netherlands, who turned to a gang, we would call it more than really, and who undertook this very savage and very public killing, and who also threatened, as Vilda's referred, who also threatened Hirsi Ali. And she is, I think, a very fascinating figure. Some of you may have read one or other of her books. She migrated to the Netherlands from Kenya, actually, although she's of Somali background. And she entered the Dutch Parliament. She made the film Submission, which of course led to the assassination of her fellow filmmaker, and which was extremely contentious. There's a very interesting documentary which you can find online, and even if you don't speak Dutch, I find it interesting to view, where a Dutch film channel had her and some young women of Muslim background who were in a women's shelter who had left abusive families to watch the film Submission with her. And these young women were horrified by the film. They saw it as an insult to their religion. And although they had been beaten up, like Submission shows women who had been abused. Hirsi Ali says because of Islam, because that's what Islam told Muslim men to do. And these young women were saying, no, Islam was what I turned to. My faith kept me strong. My faith was what made me understand that I could make it by myself, that I didn't need to put up with what my parents or what my husband were doing to it. And Hirsi Ali and one of them gets up to walk out, and Hirsi Ali kind of just waves her up with her hand saying, okay, get out there, go. And it's very interesting, like I said, body language between Hirsi Ali and these young women. I find it fascinating. And also eventually she was forced to leave the Netherlands, which that's often sort of portrayed as being forced out by Muslims, but actually no, she was forced out by her own, well, not forced out, but she chose to leave the parliament and to leave the country because of issues about her citizenship. And by her own account, she lied on her asylum application. She claimed to have been fleeing the war in Somalia, and there were many refugees coming from Somalia at that point in time, but she had been legally resident in Kenya for many years. And then her current account is that she was driven out by a forced marriage. That's also because she was on her way to Canada to join this husband, and she made up with her parents after migrating to the Netherlands. She continued to go back to Kenya to visit them. I'm certainly prepared to believe she had a falling out, whether she really had to flee for her life. But at the same time, having said that, I have every sympathy with the young woman who sees no future for herself in a particular third world country, and who tells a few fibs in order to gain education and resources that were not available to her at the point. Scott Morrison wouldn't agree with me, but I'm okay with that personally. That's just me. I don't think she should have been deported for the fibs, any fibs that she may have told. And it's also interesting because some years later, she married Niall Ferguson, a TV historian and well-known, and who had been married before that for many years to a very high-profile editor in London, and who was very well connected with other journalists. And she'd supported him through his PhD, and then he was ditching it, blah, 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 all of that stuff. And sort of celebrity culture can be as savage, well, okay, not in bloodthirsty terms, but as savage in terms of public discourse as anything to do with religion, because the British media, after she took up with the husband of this their friend, suddenly started referring to her as a fake asylum seeker, which had been completely out of bounds before, which had always been, that any suggestion that she wasn't 100% genuine in every word she'd ever spoken was seen as putting you on the same side as those who had killed her collaborator and who were threatening her life. you know, it was not possible to discuss Hirsi Ali in any kind of complex way at all without being seen as, you know, basically justifying death threats. But once she ran off with the wrong guy, all of a sudden the knives were, okay, sorry, wrong metaphor. Not the knives were out, but the pens were out, okay. Definitely the wrong metaphor for that particular case, sorry. Yeah. But now swinging back again to history, the circumstances in which Muslims became aware, Muslims living in Europe became aware that in fact they were not the first Muslim arrivals in Europe, that there were had been Muslims living there in previous centuries. Well, Bosnia really was a big point there, because of course Muslims living in what had been the Ottoman Empire. And so young Muslims living in the United Kingdom, you know, hadn't really known that they weren't or hadn't really been conscious that they weren't the first Muslims living in Europe, until all of a sudden these other Muslims were being massacred. And so I was living in London at that time. There were leaflets being handed out all over the place, asking for donations, asking for, you know, basically humanitarian care, also suggesting that young Muslims should go to Bosnia to help protect their co-religionists who were in Bosnia. I don't know how many actually went, but there was certainly a lot of talk about it. And that came immediately on the heels of the Rushdie affair, which many young Muslims were not so much experiencing as, you know, having to, as this blasphemous book, but as an experience of being made to feel outsiders, made to feel that they, because of the discourse around the platform, made to feel that they were intruders, made to feel that they didn't belong. And Bosnia, on top of that, kind of, you know, that it's the mood kind of snowballed. And, you know, the other place where Muslims, of course, had been resident was Spain. And there are now Muslim migrants in Spain as well. It's interesting, though, there's quite, I don't know the proportion of converts to migrants. I assume it's fairly small. But the migrants are quite visible in some mosques. If you go to Granada, there's a very beautiful mosque just across from the Alhambra, and it's new. But it was built by primarily by migrants rather than by, primarily by converts rather than by migrants. And it was contentious when it was built because of its location, because it was, they were accused of just wanting this vantage point from which they'd retake the Alhambra. And and because you know, according to some anti-Muslim racists, the fact that Spain had once been under Muslim control meant that it would be the first European country that Muslims would seek to reconquer, because they would see it as still being part of Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam. However, it's interesting, Muslim migrant attitudes were quite different about that. Muslim migrants, when I didn't do extensive interviews, but I did a few, were saying, look, we came here for money, we came here for a better life. We didn't really come here to establish our religion in any particular, you know, of course we want to build our mosques, of course we need halal butchers and all the rest of it, but we didn't particularly come to convert anybody, and we're trying to keep our heads down, in fact. At that time, they're in the news because those who could prove that they were had been expelled by Isabel, Jews who could prove that they'd been expelled from Spain, although centuries ago, were able to apply for Spanish citizenship, I think it was, and to go back there, which the numbers I assume would be minuscule. And so there was some talk about whether Muslims who could prove the same line of descent should have equal entitlement. And the Muslim community leaders who I asked about that said, no, we're not interested in that. Again, we're keeping our heads down. We know how much of a shit fight that'll cause. We're not looking for that. Yeah. Sorry. But Muslims, again, are very conscious of that history. as well, conscious of the fact that they, and becoming more conscious of the fact that they have been in Europe before and that they are settled in Europe now. But it is a new experience and anti-Muslim racists will go on about this for hours and read all kinds of sinister implications into it. It is a new experience for Muslims to live in a country where they're a minority and a small minority, a country that they don't rule. Muslims have lived as a minority historically in many places for a long time, India most notably, but they were in charge. They set the rules, they set the laws, they were the emperor. They weren't a minority with the rules being set by somebody else. And so there's a process of negotiation underway as to what it means to live as a religious minority in a country where you don't have a Muslim emperor. And for Europeans, there's also, because European secularism and all the institutions and values, sorry, the air quotes, that stem from it, arose from a period of settlement of very bloody religious wars, and let's not forget that. And so it's a process of how do you then fit new minorities into that process of settlement and into the institutions and into the values, for want of a better word, try not to sound like a coconut here, that have stemmed from it. Where do you fit in? In the Netherlands, there's a pillarism of and there's been suggestions that Muslims could just form a sixth pillar. I won't go into that now. And so at a shallow level, how do we allow their visibility? And headscarves and minarets are the most obvious examples like that. Minarets in Switzerland. I don't know if some of you may have seen in the news a few years ago, there was a Swiss referendum to ban minarets, the building of minarets in Switzerland, although there were like 3 or something in the whole country. And then headscarves, of course, most obviously in France, but also regulations on headscarves in Germany and elsewhere. Now, I think I'll let the exhibition speak for itself, but you will see from the extent to which that, I think, what's it called? Faith, fusion, and fashion. Yeah, it doesn't have the word hybrid in here. But when you look around that, you'll see the extent to which Islamic fashion is really quite hybrid. It's really not it's really not just some outside style that doesn't take in the styles of other places. And in fact, the more widespread that Islamic fashion becomes, the less it's attached to any particular ideology. Like headscarf used to be more closely attached to a particular Egyptian, Egypt being where it was most strong, particular form of politics. That is really not the case anymore. You can't make assumptions about a woman's politics by her headscarf. 20 years ago you could to some extent. Not really, no, not at all anymore. There's different types of headscarves, and some of them are more suggestive of conservative politics than others, but really, it's still only guesswork. And I'm again guessing, I think burqa may go the same way. I was quite hostile to burqa because I associated it with a particular form of fashion. But now it's becoming just, and whether these girls and young women will wear that fashion for the rest of their lives, I have my doubts. But yeah, it used to be associated with a particular form of fashion, but now it's a symbol of rebellion for some young women. Or okay, that's not the way they would put it, but that's my interpretation of at least some young women who wear it. And it used to be always worn with a conservative and loose style of dress. Well, now you are starting to see some fashionistas, just wearing it as a headscarf across there and teaming it with fashionable outfits, and all it is a scarf drawn across the face. It used to be a much more elaborate setup with special ties and with a robe and all the rest of it. That's becoming less so. Fashion is not my area. but at a shallow level. If you look at various forms of, you know, fashion rebellion over the years, like punk, if anybody can remember that far back, you know, that were just anti-establishment. I think for some young women that's what it is. It used to signify belonging to a particular conservative style of Islam. In Australia, I used to be able to guess which organisation they might belong to, not anymore. Anyhow, I'll leave it at that. And I think we've got time for questions here.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I know that was very random.